You got Wayne and Richard and Mark here. Arib is actually having some horrible computer issues today. And remember, today for both Arib and Mark is the middle of the night or early in the morning. So he on a Monday now. So, or it's actually Tuesday, right? So, but he couldn't get his computer fixed in the middle of the night. So he's not able to be here with us. So everybody, we are so excited today. Mark, would you make sure to start the recording if you haven't already?
Okay. No, we were kind of informal, so yeah. I will officially. Yep, we're officially recording now.
Awesome, thank you. We started a little late, everybody, because I had some problem actually using the phone audio to get into GoToWebinar. I usually don't have any problem at all. I just boom, dial right in because my satellite system delays my audio, and it's just better to do it from my phone. Right now, I'm not on the phone because I couldn't get it to work. But anyway, we're excited to have Richard. Richard has been a friend for a long time. As a matter of fact, Scott Cutter reached out to me today, Richard, because he comes to these sometimes. I don't know whether he's here with us today or not, but I was trying to remember, did you introduce me to Scott? I think you might have.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
For everybody else, this is a realtor in Costa Rica, and I'm sure Richard will talk a little bit about his Costa Rica journeys here during our talk. But anyway, Richard and I have been friends for a long time. We share so many things in common. And then, over the years, we've shared people. Jason Aubrey, who you guys have all heard about, was both a real key person in my organization, and he was an important person in Richard's. And Richard's daughters have grown up in front of my eyes. We used to both live on the southeast end of Denver, and now I'm living northern Denver, and Richard still lives down in that area. What we're going to do is for about 10 minutes, we're just going to sort of interview and talk back and forth, and then Richard's got an exciting presentation for us. A little bit of logistics for all of you. Please put some ones in the question area right now if you're hearing us all right. Mark is going to be watching that, hearing us and seeing the screens. And then secondly, put in where you're at in the world so that we can see that, so we can know where you're at. And throughout the presentation, ask questions. And we may not answer them right when you ask them, but we're going to get to them. So we'll let Richard guide us as to when the questions get asked. But by the way, we have another one of the coolest names I always love who's here in our audience today, Richard. He's been a guy in our group forever. Mirko Matic. So Mirko is his first name, Matic is last name, but it's Mirko Matic. So anyway, Richard, give us a little bit of history about your 5 minutes about just your life and what's brought you from wherever you started to where you are today.
Sure, I'll give you the down and dirty. I grew up in the South. I'm originally from Georgia. If you can't tell from a little bit of accent that I've got. I grew up early years in the city of Atlanta and then moved to South Georgia and got more interested in things in that area. I used to hunt or fish almost every day for several years growing up, and graduated high school early, became a paramedic, worked in that all through college, and then worked in the OR and became what they call a surgical PA, and I started doing disaster response and relief in college and several different countries all over, and became interested in solving some of the problems that we saw on a regular basis in natural disasters and post-disaster, and even in trying to find ways to resolve challenges before disasters happen by being better prepared. And that kind of guided some of the stuff that we'll talk about later. For about 20 years after college, I was in the field of, I started out in real estate investing and did well, and I was a trader and developed a strategy for predicting forward trends in markets, and that technology has afforded me the ability to start several hedge funds and and being in other businesses. We were in the hotel business and restaurant business and other things. And as Wayne alluded to, we actually moved our family to Costa Rica. We bought a hotel down there and a ranch and some other projects, and actually lived there for a little while. And just a great time, wonderful people, beautiful country. If you haven't been there, call us and we'll make a recommendation. If not, you can call Scott Cutter. He'll help you as well. But I have a wonderful wife and two great kids. Both are semi-adult now, as Wayne alluded to. And I spend probably, we'll walk through the process, but I went from working on problems in the U.S. to working on problems largely internationally. So I spend probably 3 to 4 months a year now in Africa, about a month a year between Europe and the Middle East, and probably 2 to 4 weeks in Latin America. So I do a fair amount of international travel. But the COVID crisis has brought on a re-interest from people domestically to solve some of the problems that we've been bringing up for years with regard to our food system. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, I hope.
Cool. Richard, what motivated you to become kind of full-time serious about hunger and dealing with food issues in the world, and made you give up your very lucrative and very successful career in the investment world? Was there some single event or just a whole bunch of things coming together?
You know, there were a couple of events, and I know that this may not be a faith-based forum, but quite frankly, it was God stepping in and saying, you need to go in this direction. So I had an opportunity to resolve some challenges and create the global food exchange. And from that, I ended up in the Middle East and in Africa, and I was exposed to a technology that allows us to buy commodities and store them for up to 20 years with no degradation. And I came back being a greedy capitalist pig, thinking I could arbitrage, which was my area of specialty, was arbitrage, thinking I could arbitrage the commodity markets in the U.S. using this technology. And I literally, I was sitting down thinking about it, and it was one of those times where God spoke to me and said, Richard, it's not about the U.S. and it's not about you. It's about, there's a bigger problem out there, and that's what you need to look at. So I went back to Africa, and it kind of unfolded what was needed. The food system there was broken in many different parts, and all we needed to do was to start organizing, putting those pieces of the puzzle together, and to look at things as a system versus looking at singular things. And we'll kind of walk through the evolution of that system today a little bit in this presentation. But quite frankly, I called my wife and I said, I think we're going to change what we're focused on. And so now we've been doing it for 7 years, and it's been awesome.
So changing gears a little bit and back to Costa Rica just a tiny bit, but more about you. You didn't just get in business over there and have a hotel and that. You built an amazing recreation facility. Tell everybody a little bit about that. And I don't know whether you sold that when you were sort of, or you still have it. So maybe you can describe that.
Sure. So we, my business partner, who is originally from South Carolina, he and I had bought several different businesses and lands and hotels and what have you together. And while we were in Costa Rica, we also bought a 500-acre ranch. And we call it a ranch, but it was really 300 acres plus of it was primary and secondary jungle. And we built a canopy tour. And so for those of you who know, canopy tours actually started in Costa Rica probably 50 years ago by guys researching the jungle canopies. And so researchers would come down and they would tie lines between trees and shimmy across them, and they started building hanging bridges and what have you. So now it's become a whole thing. And in fact, they're in Colorado. They're all over the place. When we first started, there wasn't one in Colorado. And so we went and traveled around and saw all of the different ones that were out there and said, we want to build something bigger and better. And so we did. So we built lines, one that has a line that's almost a mile long. It's now a double line, almost a mile long. I think we have 10 hanging bridges. And very quickly, in about a year and a half, it became the #1 canopy tour in Costa Rica. And it's been steadily growing every single year, except this one. So as of 3 or 4 months ago, that slowed down dramatically. But we sold off our hotel there a couple of years ago, and we sold off some of the other stuff. I've been really heavily focused on what I do with the Global Food Exchange and through the World Food Bank, and that's been everything that we've been focused on. But Scott Thompson, who you know as well, ran the Canopy Tour. He and his wife have done a fantastic job and kept it steadily growing over several years. But if anyone goes to Costa Rica, you should try out El Santuario. Means the sanctuary. El Santuario Canopy Adventure. It's a lot of fun.
Cool. Well, two more questions, and then I'm going to let you go on your presentation. Tell us about some kind of a tool that you've used over the last month or, period of time, short period of time, whether it's a tool to do things physically, whether it's an internet tool, whether it's a book, anything that you really just can think about quickly and then tell everybody else about it. Because I asked almost all our speakers this question. We've had lots of answers. So just something you've started to use fairly recently that you really like.
Well, this may be something that other people have said because it happens to be right on with you. I actually read Mark Shepard's book on permaculture, and which is just really fantastic. And I've read other books and what have you, but I every chapter I learned something new. And for somebody that's been involved in agriculture and development for 10 years now, it was really interesting and really exciting. And it speaks to the complexities and to the kind of the mix of art and science that's involved in this effort.
Cool. Someday we'll have a call and I'll introduce you to Mark and you guys can talk about lots of mutual interest things. Last question. This is kind of always the toughest one, and sometimes it's one people like to give specific answers for, and some like to be real general. Tell us about some event that has happened in your life that at the time was really negative, but as time has gone on, it turns out that it was something that was really very good for you and for your life. So you can be really vague or you can be very specific, either way you like.
Yeah, that's a great question. I probably would say it kind of ties back to Colorado. Again, I grew up in Georgia, and I came out here as a senior in college. I was on a 4-year ROTC scholarship, and I'd also been a paramedic, and I had a number of certifications, and one of my new certifications was mountain rescue. But people from Colorado would laugh at somebody from Georgia with a mountain rescue training, right? Because they would say, why isn't it really foothills rescue? Is it really mountain rescue? But I came out here to work on a disaster response team and a helicopter team based out of Boulder County, and went to University of Northern Colorado. For people that are from all over the country, UNC means something different if you're from Georgia than it means here. But University of Northern Colorado, not North Carolina. And I was actually on a field training exercise, and we were doing climbing exercises. And in an effort to get down quickly to set up for another one, I did what they call an Australian rappel, where you jump off the face to go down. And because we had been running behind instead of following the rules, I let someone else tie me in, which I would never do. Tied me in. Everyone else had been doing Swiss seat. He tied me in. I jumped off the face of the mountain, and I fell 62 feet. When I went to brake, I had no brake because I was tied in backwards. So I went to brake, and I kind of rolled, and I broke my arm in about 77 places, I think. Broke a couple of ribs, compressed some my thoracic, cervical, and lumbar spine, and I had a light brain injury and it lost my memory for a little while, and ended up going to the hospital and wearing a full cast and a back brace and all that for a few months. And for those people who've spent time in the mountains or done climbing, a 60-foot fall, 5-6 stories is a long way. And I was a paramedic. I was actually the paramedic on the team. So that created some issues as well. But it was one of those times where I realized that I'd been given a second chance. And excuse me. And I knew that, I started walking through the process of the giftings that we have of knowledge and family and friends and relationship and the capacities that you're given, each of us being independent in those skill sets, not everyone given the same thing, everyone being given an independent grouping of those skills. And it sat with me that I was here to do something. I could rest when I die, kind of thing, that there was something that I needed to get done. And so I set about seeking out what it was that I could do to add value to people and find purpose in what I was supposed to be here for. So that's kind of driven me, I guess, most of my life. And now, 30 years later, literally, my memory challenges are coming back some, and my brain injury is starting to show itself in some other ways, and it's reinvigorated me to go out and get things done. So I don't know if that's the story you were looking for, and I probably shouldn't have. Anyway.
No, any stories. And by the way, again, I'll just tell you a little bit more about Richard's family. One of his daughters is an amazing climber, and I'm sure she's heard that story and knows of that fall, but has followed in Richard's footsteps on the climbing side a little bit.
Yeah, but she's substantially better climber than I, of course. But anyway, yeah.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And by the way, don't feel bad about the emotion that brought. Anyway, I'm going to let you take off. I'm actually going to mute my webcam, so I'll be here, but I just don't want them to be looking at me while I'm there, and mute my mic and just go ahead and run with your presentation. I don't know whether you're doing your slides, Richard, or whether Mark is, but one of the two of you are. You're going to do cool. And when you're close to done, I'll turn my webcam back on and we'll get to people's questions. And guys, ask questions. I know that Richard will be more than happy to answer them. So please ask us some questions. So go for it, Richard. All yours.
Great. Well, I'm hoping that if it's done properly, that through the presentation, it'll actually generate questions. It'll make, the goal is to have you think. And my hope, by the way, at the end, as Stephen Covey would say, you begin with the end in mind. My hope is that as we walk through this process, that you see the questions that we're all bringing up as a collaborative, as a group, and that you'll join us, because part of what I'm hoping to get out of this is more people working together to solve some big problems. So with that, I'll kind of begin. We call this a Zero Hunger Project, and I actually did a TEDx talk on this. If you want to look it up, especially if you have trouble sleeping, you can watch that. It'll help you folks. But we call it the Zero Hunger Project primarily because a lot of what we do now is focused on solving specific problems, but there's not as much work being done to look at the entirety of the system. And I was honored a couple of years ago to be appointed by the president to the advisory board of USAID. For those of you who don't know, USAID is the U.S. Agency for International Development. It's the largest single funding organization for aid and development from the U.S. people. And so I was honored to be part of that. There's 7 people on the board. 4 are university presidents. One's a labor economist. Another is a government attorney. And then there's one entrepreneur, and I'm that token entrepreneur. And it's been a fantastic journey. I learn something new every time I'm with them, and we have weekly and monthly meetings. But one of the things that I did notice is at any given time, there's 2,700 to 3,500 projects or programs going on. And very few, if anyone, actually knows all of the projects and programs going on. And in many countries, we've been pushing dollars for 20, 40, even 50 years into some of the same exact towns without any real change. And countries in Africa have taken note, right? They've seen the difference between those who have gotten aid and those who haven't. So for example, the country of Ethiopia, in the same year that South Korea decided to change the way that it was following a socialist, communist model, was going to follow a capitalist model, and it's made all the difference. And because they followed a free market system, it looks like they're miles and miles ahead of most other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So Ethiopia is now saying, hey, you made the decision to go towards capitalist markets, and we made the decision to go towards communism, and we're still in poverty and you've changed. So they literally go back and forth now, finding out how they can pivot and turn and adopt those changes, and they are making them because someone else has already set the standard. They're making those adjustments much more rapidly, and it's having a great impact on their economy and what have you. But in the when we deal with hunger and we deal with poverty, because they're both linked together, we find that we often come in and say, well, we have poor quality corn in this area, so we're going to fund the development of better seed. And we're going to do a seed hybridization and replication and distribution program. And so we go into several countries and we push that program out. And then 2 seasons later, they've grown seed the one season. The next season they distribute it. All of a sudden, everyone grows 3 times more maize than they've ever grown before. It's a miracle. But 2 weeks later, the markets crash because there's not enough people to buy that maize. In other countries, it all has aflatoxin because they don't know how to irrigate it or harvest it or store it properly. And so it creates a series of issues and challenges that didn't necessarily have to be there if the approach was systematic versus programmatic. So we'll get a little bit more into that. But as part of our operation here under the parent company called the Global Food Exchange, we decided to take this project on, partly because I spend so much time with global leaders. It was an opportunity to bring them together and get insights from them, as well as people from in the field. And my passion or my skill set really is in that area of building efficiencies and building algorithms, much like what we would do in medicine. If someone has a heart attack, we know exactly what to do. If someone, dies and if you've taken CPR, you start with this, start with that, airway, breathing, circulation, so on and so forth. And so we need to do the same thing in agriculture. The difference is, while most human bodies, no matter where they are on the planet, are similar enough that CPR works, agriculture is not the same. It's a lot more dynamic, and everyone on here knows that. So it takes a little bit more work and a little bit more effort, but there is a math answer to it. There is a way to identify what we're doing now. We know where we need to go to feed an extra billion people on the planet, what have you. We also know that the goals are sustainability of soils and maintenance of water and all these other goals. So we have a plethora of goals. We know where we are, we know where we need to go. If we extrapolate out where we're trending now, we can alter some of those and we can add some of those and we can subtract from some of those. So the question is, what do we keep? What do we add to? What do we subtract from? And that's kind of the effort of the Zero Hunger Project. And I'm literally hoping that many of you today will say, hey, I would like to be part of that. But before we get started into that, I want to just say that, what's really critical is to begin with the basics. When we talk about food security, what we're really talking about is getting food where it's needed, when it's needed. And what we're finding out, and this is a fantastic time to get into this, is because normally we talk about food systems. When we think about food systems, everyone tends to think about large farms and big time storage and all that kind of stuff. But what we're finding out is that actually a dynamic system is completely different from that. It's actually turned on its head. In fact, when I was in university, one of the big things we studied in business when you're getting your business degree is just in time. Most of you guys are probably familiar with the JIT model, the just in time. We want to have just enough inputs coming in to make just what I need to sell to the person who just ordered it. That's just in time. But what we really find out now is that when it comes to critical items like food and probably water and some other things like that, it would be a good idea to have more than you need in some areas as a backup in case there's a disruption in that value chain or in that logistics chain or somewhere else. So actually, a stronger model is more dynamic. It's not just in time. And from that, we've pretty quickly come to realize that we don't need just institutional growth. We need a much bigger production on the local level. And by having local food production actually creates global food security. And we'll talk more about that, but you can have local production and regional storage. And when it's done in tandem, you can actually build a level of global resiliency. I'll give you a quick background on what we did with GFE. GFE is Global Food Exchange, and we started this back in 2003, in 2013. We started the work on it in 2010 and formalized it in 2013. Traveled all over the world and met with leaders in FEMA, leaders in California, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, everywhere where there are major disasters on a regular basis. And basically came to find out that some of the strategies and some of the simple technologies that have been around for a long, long time were becoming more cost effective. The technology that allow us to store food for longer periods of time. Most of them were in one of two categories. It was either freeze dried or dehydrated. And so you could take pasta primavera, you could even take chicken cacciatore, but you could take those items, and I would say 90+% of what we use is actually dehydrated, not freeze dried. So it's less expensive, easier to do, and so on and so forth. And those meals could be combined in a regionally specific way. So, for example, you could have cheese grits in the South, and you could have Southwestern chili in the Southwest, and so on and so forth. And those meals could be completed. You could have breakfast, lunch, dinner, appetizers, beverages, what have you. And many of those meals could also have a pre-mixed vitamin and mineral, 26 to 28 vitamins and minerals added, so that even in a single meal, the user could get everything that they needed for nutrition in that single meal. So then that gave application to being used not just for the US after a Katrina or Sandy, it gave application for Haiti, Puerto Rico, and remote areas. And then there's another step to that. You could actually get simpler and cheaper, simpler and cheaper, simpler and cheaper, to the point that you can actually do what they call it in the World Food Program, CSB, which is corn soy blend. And they have CSB plus, which is corn soy blend plus vitamins and minerals. And they have CSB plus plus, which is plus vitamins and minerals plus powdered dairy for people that are 2 and under. And we can make those meals for 12 to 20 cents each. And the challenge is, what we found is that internationally and even domestically, 60+% of the cost of getting those meals for people after a disaster is in logistics. 60%. How much more food could you give to someone? What kind of premium could you pay to the provider if you could solve for logistics? And there's been several people in the EAT community who have talked about, from vertical farming and local sourcing and all that. One of the big things is cutting out all of that stuff in the middle. So you can actually pay a little, you don't have to pay 100% of that doesn't go to the cost of food. You can actually increase what the farmer gets paid, and you can reduce in some measures what the consumer pays just by making those things more efficient. But what we did is we took those meals and we said, well, we're going to start packaging these in advance, because what we had noticed is that after natural disasters, people would be waiting on something, and organizations like Send Relief out of Atlanta is the largest provider in the US with mobile kitchens, would come and show up, and they'd be called by FEMA and say, look, we need 12 locations in Louisiana, Mississippi, and they would show up with their trucks, their kitchens, volunteer staff, all ready to go. And then they would sit there for 3, 4, 5, sometimes 8 days waiting on food to come from FEMA suppliers like Cisco and others, because that's not their primary business. So they would have to coordinate. They would have to send a report in saying, this is who we're trying to take care of, and this is what we think we need. They would have to find out what regional offices it would come from, so on and so forth. If you're a natural disaster victim, waiting 3, 5, 8 days is not cool. That's not good at all. Not to mention, when you have to go through all that effort, the cost is really high. So for a fraction of the cost, we can actually store food and have it ready just outside of these disaster-prone areas. And we can have it in family-style meals where people can take it back to their home if their home's secure, prepare the meals themselves, or mass feeding, where it goes into these commercial kitchens like what Send Relief uses in Salvation Army and what have you. And it can all be fortified, regionally specific, so on and so forth. That's what we started with Global Food Exchange. We put them into these multi-layer Mylar bags with oxygen scavengers that pull all the oxygen out. And by pulling the oxygen out, we remove the capacity for viral, fungal, bacterial growth. And it makes all the difference in the world. And it's worked quite well. And even today, we have just under 1 million meals stored in just out in Spanish Fork, Utah. But that led to this idea of creating a network of stored food that we called the Global Food Exchange. We found that in international markets, there was an opportunity to bring in a new disruptive technology. And the reason I put the pictures on here is so that you can see just how big these bags are. So the bags are about the size of 2 40-foot containers stacked on top of 2 40-foot containers. They're 100 metric tons in size. And what's interesting is they are very much like those of you who are in medicine, they're very much like what we use in surgery for people with unusual pathogenicity. So if you're in certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa and you have tumors on the liver or pancreas and you think that they may be containing something like hemorrhagic fever, you want to excise that and study it. You put it in a bag. You want to be able to transport that bag without any danger to anyone. The material that we use for that allows no gas and no moisture across that barrier is similar to what they use here. And then they put layers of PVC fabric on either side. In the middle, you see there's a bottom half and a top half. There's a zipper. And so they leave the top off, they stack it. You can see it's about 5 meters high when it's all done. They put the top on it and they zip it up, and it's a hermetically sealed zipper. So literally what happens is those bags that you see those guys stacking there, they're actually, that's corn that's been brought out, dumped onto a table, and the dirty ones have been taken out, and the stones and the chaff and whatever has been pulled and then put back into a bag and stored. But there still is bacteria and there's still pests. And what happens is over about 4 or 5 days, the pests actually respire the remaining oxygen. And then all the oxygen's gone. So now it's a hermetically sealed, oxygen-free environment. So the bacteria dies, fungus either dies or goes dormant, and the pests die. I went and saw maize, corn, that had been stored in these, and we opened some up, took it out. It still had color, texture. You could dimple it. You could grind it into grade A flour. And it had been in one of these bags for 15 years. So for those of you who don't appreciate that, 15 years is huge. It's huge with a capital H. It's really big. In the commodities market in the US, something that's grade 1 often will go to grade 3 over 12 months. In sub-Saharan Africa, with high levels of humidity and poor storage, it'll go to grade 3 in 3 to 6 months. This can maintain grade for a decade or two. So it literally removes what we would call, in the arbitrage world, it removes the calendar risk, the risk of time from holding a commodity. So most people in those markets don't want to store and hold it for the prices in the market to go up, because the quality of the commodity is going down at the same time the price of the commodity is going up. So they're trying to find this place where they make more, it goes up, the price goes up faster than the commodity value goes down, and it makes it very difficult for farmers, and it puts them at a lot of risk for something that's their primary income. So this helps solve some of that problem. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I just want you to kind of put that into your thinking cap, how disruptive technology integration can actually play a part in building a functioning, scalable, sustainable ecosystem. There's a market opportunity in this as well. So number one, when you harvest it, supply is going up shortly, but all the farmers in most areas are trying to sell within a special, 15 to 45 day period while things are ripe and what have you. That includes poultry and dairy and beef farmers as well, right? And as all the supply comes in, the price goes down. If you're able to pull some of that supply out of the market and not push it and hold it for a little while until price goes up, you can actually make money on that arbitrage by holding it instead of 60 to 90 days, holding it for 90 to 120 or 180. The other issue is in places like sub-Saharan Africa, the arbitrage or the inefficiency between the low price of the season and the high price of the season, where in the United States, it's around 24 to 30%. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's 64 to 120%. It's massive, massive, such that the majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the manufacturers, the people who make cereal, that make animal feed, little things like that, they actually shut their doors for 3 months a year because the cost of inputs is too high and they can't be competitive. So if you're able to guarantee farmers a little higher price because you can store it for longer, and you're able to sell it into the market before the price spikes because you have enough supply to bring that down, you can actually effectuate an arbitrage and make money in the middle while also resolving that issue of volatility. And these countries are never going to go through a major industrial revolution when they're dependent on agriculture and they can't resolve the issue of volatility in their commodity market. It's just not going to happen. This will enable farmers to make more money, save more money, get more education. It'll allow industries to work 12 months a year instead of 9 months a year, to use higher quality inputs instead of taking what they can get. And one thing begets another. So the goals that we're trying to get to, the first of those is a sustainable solution. So GFE dries and stores its food as long as it's needed. And the technology allows us to buy from farmers and hold it for 15 years if need. We can get food where it's needed, when it's needed, because I can also ship it to store it in other places during the rainy season when trucks are all over the place and they need someone to rent them. I can keep the trucks moving and I pay a lower price for logistics and so on and so forth. And what ends up happening is we become that dependable source for low-cost food to fill the gaps. And that includes schools, since most schools in those countries actually, that's the school system pays for lunch for those children. And the food banks are often constrained. They don't have enough food available, or the cost of the food is too expensive. So it solves a number of other problems, and we could extrapolate on and on and on. But by having that commodity available, I can slowly bleed it out to where it's needed, to places like schools, in what they call internally displaced people, IDPs, refugees, natural disaster victims, and the like. It's also a scalable solution. Anytime you get corporate sponsors coming in saying, hey, we want to buy a container and do whatever, that is paid for food, and it's needed when it's needed by the relief agencies, and other folks want to come in and pay for it. That just helps us to remake meals. So we just go and make more. So we go from 3 million to 4 million, 4 million to 8 million. FEMA reimbursement is additive. So FEMA actually pays these organizations. So if you run an NGO and you want to go deliver the food, you can actually buy it, deliver it, send them the bill. You have to be an approved FEMA implementing partner. But the point is, they can actually pay for it. So Salvation Army and Red Cross and others, it's not coming out of the money they raise. They're actually being reimbursed for the food. So it's additive. And the warehouses are networked. So the idea is, if you have a really bad disaster in Louisiana, you can pull food from Texas, you can pull it from Ohio, Colorado, from wherever you need to fill in the gaps. But by having a network, you don't have to have all of it in a single place. Right now, FEMA has 7 primary storage facilities. We're trying to take that to about 28. The other is, this helps us drive towards zero food waste. And I grew up in Georgia, where we're famous for peaches. People in Colorado would say we're famous for peaches. So on the western slope, we actually do have really great peaches in Colorado. But in many of those, and I grew up actually spending summers, a couple of summers picking peaches. And ironically, for a fellow whose name was Mr. Roundtree, a great name for a guy who's a farmer. But anyway, I would pick peaches for Mr. Roundtree, and we'd bring them back. And he would put them on the back of his truck and sell them to folks, driving along the street. But about 20% of those would go to waste. They'd get too soft, or people would say, I don't want this one, and they'd throw it away. I don't want that one, they'd throw it away, and they'd go to waste. And what he used to do is, I would take those to my mother and often to my grandmother, and she would make peach cobbler out of those. But she couldn't make that much peach cobbler. We had so much waste just from that one truck that there was a lot wasted. But if Mr. Roundtree at the time had another solution, perhaps a solar dryer where he could slice those up and dry them, and then had a place that he could take dried peaches to, you might actually save that. Not only could you save it, but in places like sub-Saharan Africa, we pay 3 to 4 times more than what you would get for that tomato fresh for it to be dehydrated. So there's an opportunity to take those at their ripest with the most sugar, the most nutrients, slice and dice and dry. And that's an opportunity that may be here. I don't want to spend too much time on GFE and the World Food Bank, but basically in the US, we began as the Global Food Exchange. We started going internationally and realizing that we could store large volumes of commodities, thousands of metric tons of corn and soy and wheat and sorghum and rice, in addition to dried fruits and vegetables. We realized, and actually a group at University of Colorado wrote a white paper on this, we can actually treat food as an asset class. And if you can imagine food as an asset class, farmers think about this all the time. But if you think about the food you have stored in jars as an asset, if there's bad times like COVID or whatever, or worse, which will happen, not when, but if, you have that. That is a measure of security you can't get anywhere else. Quite frankly, deposits into your bank won't solve that problem. Food security is going to end up coming to the home level, right? And when you speak with people in sub-Saharan Africa on a regular basis, and even parts of Latin America, you realize that for them, they don't have a home mortgage. If they have a home, they built it. And most of them don't have a car mortgage, or a car loan rather. And so for them, the definition of wealth, the definition of growth in wealth is defined really by how much corn or soy they have in their field, how much they have saved, and how much potentially they may grow this coming season. That's really the definition of prosperity for them. Their measure of prosperity is food security. So if they were able to take that food and store a little bit, and store a little bit more, and store a little bit more, it would actually be a hedge against the deflation of the currencies in most of those countries, but it would also be a very, very practical way to build wealth. So what we decided to do is to create a model, instead of just taking meals, to take raw commodities and store them in these large bags. And we created an entity wholly owned by the Global Food Exchange called the World Food Bank. And through that, we've gotten partnerships like the government of Uganda, who's committed $50 million. We have a fellow named Akon, who is a singer, songwriter, philanthropist. He got $1 billion line of credit from the Chinese government to finance solar in Africa, and he's now in 18 countries and millions of households, providing solar TVs, power, lighting, USB stuff for phones and what have you, and is now helping us to raise $200 million for the World Food Bank Fund. But one of the interesting things that we found is that if you organize into 4 different areas: technology, finance, markets, and food banks, in each of those areas that we spend most of our time in, we're working to take technology that allows us to bring farmers to market more readily, to cut out a lot of the middleman, because those transactions are where farmers lose profit. And that's the reason so many farmers live in poverty. Of the 800 million people that live in dire poverty around the world today, more than 80% of them are in farming. So I do another talk on this, but if you think about it practically, literally the people that need to improve their farming so that they go from 1/8 of what we produce in the US and 1/3 to 1/4 of what they produce in Latin America per acre, we need them to step up their quality and their quantity so that they can feed the next billion people coming to the planet. But we kind of first need them to be able to feed themselves. It's kind of tough that a guy that's a farmer can't even earn enough money to feed his own family. They're the people that are starving. So we're working on technologies that help increase the speed at which a farmer can get to market and the transparency and what have you. We're also working with other partners to help finance those farmers with high quality inputs so that they can grow better stuff. And then if they grow better, we guarantee them a market. So we'll come to thousands of farmers and say, look, if you use these quality hybrid seeds, if you use these organic fertilizers, we will guarantee you a minimum price. And so that way we start creating an expectation and a dependence on kind of backing up those farmers. The other is with food banks. We become kind of that food bank ourselves. But in the U.S., I want to end up kind of circling back around to this. In the U.S., I think there's an opportunity to replicate what we do with farmers with gardeners, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And that's and I want to say gardeners because it includes farmers. But if you can get all the way down to where it works with a gardener, it'll certainly work. If it works with somebody with an acre, it'll certainly work with someone with 10 or 20 or 50 acres. But to begin with, we're trying to go from an idea or a model of looking at things as projects and programs to a methodology or a thinking where we look at systems. And oftentimes, even from the permaculture model, we're looking at a system in our own land. So, but we're having to look at a system. It's soil and water and logistics and distance from home and all of these other things all build together, which is one reason it's so difficult to get people to use a permaculture model. And they really need to go through a class or a program to really learn all the details, because every little detail adds typically exponential value. In projects and programs, it really only requires you do one thing well. If we're trying to grow better corn, well, we'll get better seed. But if you don't do the others, it fails. If you have a simple set of metrics, you go, did they grow better corn? Did they grow more? Yes, then it's easy to measure. So when things are donor driven, when it's driven by, and I won't use any specific names, but you know the names of those large global donors, they want to see the metrics to be able to go out and say, look, we improved this, we improved that. But oftentimes the system is still 20 years, 50 years later, it's still broken because projects and programs were not done in tandem and collaboratively in order to solve the problem on a system basis. It also can be done with less money and so on and so forth. And it doesn't need as many people. So that's one reason those things go. The other is we end up looking at things ex post. So we end up looking at the problem that we had and trying to solve the problem instead of thinking outside the box. And one of the things that, having been a trader for many years, is not to follow the crowd, but to think the opposite of the crowd. When everyone's running, when everyone's selling, I'm a buyer. When everyone's buying, I'm a seller, right? It's the same thing with systems thinking. We need to go from saying, this is the problem they had, let's find a way to fix it. Well, just because you fixed it for COVID doesn't mean it's going to solve for the EMP that's going to hit in 2 years, right? We have to think outside the box. Water contamination, you know how easy it would be for people to contaminate large bodies of water in the US. You know how easy it is for EMP. I don't want to be I'm not trying to use scare tactics. I'm just saying that we're subject to all sorts of risks. And if we really are truly wanting to build systems that protect us from those risks, then we have to think in systems. And we have to do it collaboratively, because it's very difficult for one person or one family, or even in many instances, one community to do it together. It requires that we do multiple things, and we use a complex of metrics to measure that success. And oftentimes it either requires more of a budget or more inputs, whether that's more people participating, but it requires more assets being put into the mix to build that system. And one of the things that I've shared with international donors and funders is that, and well, I won't go into the other groups, but is that, you know, if you think about in the United States, the data suggests that new business, if you're starting a new business, 4 out of 5 new businesses are going to fail within the first 5 years. 4 out of 5, 80%. Interestingly, the inverse of that's true with franchises. If you open a McDonald's or a Wendy's or a Pizza Hut or whatever, likelihood is that 80% of those will be in business in 5 years. And quite frankly, it's not because Pizza Hut's better than Jet is better than Domino's, because there's 47 different pizza franchises. The reason for their success is they have systems in place. There's a system for how you buy, a system for how you produce, for how you market, for how you store, so on and so forth, how you manage your finances, how you do savings, all the pools of funds that you put aside, so on and so forth. Those systems assure a certain level of success. And the same thing can be done in agriculture. So one of the great challenges we have is, how do we take a grouping of complex systems and do we make it simple? So complex doesn't mean complicated. It just means complex. So we need to get past the idea that complex systems require really complicated solutions. They don't have to be really complicated, but they are going to be complex. So I want to share with you the zero hunger formula, kind of the basics. The goal for us in this phase 1 effort is to establish the metrics for a sample system. How do we take one model in one geography, in 1 or 2 or 3, not solving for poultry and dairy and beef and pulses and grains and all together, but solve for one section, one system, and build the metrics that are there. And, you know, the question is it just a list of these 4 or 5 things? And when I, you know, and again, I remember, I'm from Georgia. I have a little bit of redneck in me. We always want to think there's these 4 things build a perfect system, or maybe it's these 6 things. But when I think of that model, it makes me think of David Allan Coe's song. If you guys have ever heard the Perfect Country Song, I'll let you hear the story. So David Allan Coe is a country songwriter, for those of you who don't know, and he said that a buddy of his had sent him a song and said, David, I've sent you the perfect country song. And this was David's response. I'm going to play it for you just so you'll appreciate it better.
It was the perfect country western song. I wrote him back a letter and I told him it was not the perfect country western song because he hadn't said anything at all about mama, or Frank, or truck, or prison, or drunk. Well, he sat down and wrote another verse to the song, and he sent it to me. After reading it, I realized my friend had written the perfect country western song, and I felt obliged to include it on this album. The last verse goes like this here. Strong, demon, mom, gone to prison. Wait.
It goes on for a little bit, but you get the idea. Is there a formula for saying we need to cover this, 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 and this, and we'll have the perfect system? Well, it's a little harder than writing a country song. It actually is going to require metrics for every value system, every agricultural value chain. And so it's not that easy, but there is a formula to it. And it's not as simple as what do we plant and how do we plant? Where do we grow? When do we grow? How do we grow? And when do we pick? How do we pick? And what do we do after we pick? There's a number of other things that kind of go into that. And we can organize it in different ways, but it gets more difficult when you are focused on multiple items versus one. If you're growing corn and on 5,000 acres or soya on 10,000 acres, whatever the case may be, it's a little simpler. But we all know that that's not the system that needs to fill the gap right now. And this, interestingly, the same solution in sub-Saharan Africa is the solution in Latin America is the solution in the United States. There's got to be more locally grown systems where people are growing. It doesn't have to be everything. They don't have to grow tomatoes, peppers, onions, carrots, the whole thing. But there's got to be an organization where we grow and solve two problems. So how do you grow enough volume that it's commercially viable? Well, one is you have to grow with other people that are growing similar items. And how do you grow enough diversity that you can actually support your family with nutrition you need, maintain the structures in the soil that you need, and all the other benefits that come from a diversified agricultural model. And we know that in America, the number of food and gardeners is fairly similar all over. There's a little bit heavier weighting in the South, but all over the country, there are people doing individual gardens. And I'm sure you guys have heard the numbers of, the average farm is, or average garden is, 6 acres. Some say it's 96 acres. But the difference between mean and median and average are pretty distinct. There's a huge percentage of people that have 1 acre or less, and you can grow a tremendous amount of food on a single acre. Our belief is that in this world of communications, of the ability to communicate one thing to another, is that we're working on an app to be able to allow farmers to communicate with local markets, as well as farmers to communicate with food banks. And we'll talk about how that is. Food banks, most of them are past carrying fruits and vegetables because they get them when the store doesn't want them, and then they're rotten or too bad the next day. So it's just they become a trash dump. And so the ability to be able to bring things that still have time on them is best suited coming from local gardeners. So by connecting gardeners with food banks, and there's some organizations that do some of that, but to do it on an electronic basis through an application model, we have it kind of diagrammed out. But I think there's an opportunity there. We'd love to work with people on how how to really make it work effectively. But one of the things that we've seen in Latin America, we've seen it now in sub-Saharan Africa, and we hope to see more of it in the US, not just your in-house dryer that you put your beef jerky on or you dry your fruits, but real, semi-commercial size. If it's a small greenhouse, if it's a 20-foot container or what have you, but a solar dryer. And many of these will work, as you guys know, grains, pulses, tubers, fruits, vegetables, all of the above. And being able to take, I'll give you an example, and then you can extrapolate that into your own gardening work. In sub-Saharan Africa, a farmer who grows tomatoes is going to lose 50 to 70% of those tomatoes. She's only going to sell 30%. She's going to eat 10%, and the other goes to waste. She grows tomatoes because they're easier to grow, and she has hope that one day she'll be able to sell them. So they keep doing it, yet they go to waste. If she were able to slice those tomatoes up, a 5-gallon bucket of tomatoes sells for $1.50, $1.80, a 5-gallon bucket of ripe tomatoes. If she were to take that same 5-gallon bucket and dry them, so doing nothing else but slicing them, clean them, slice them, and put them on a solar dryer, they would be worth somewhere between $6 and $8. So there's almost a reason not to sell any in the market. Just grow them, dry them. Once you get as many as you want, take them to market a week later, what have you. Once they're dried, you've extended the shelf life exponentially. Not just weeks, but 6 to 12 months once they're packaged properly. So you'll have people that are going to start aggregating those dried fruits and vegetables, bringing them together, and then people like us will buy them. And we have bags like you saw that are 100 metric ton. We have ones that are 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. And I can take all the oxygen out of that, and I can store those dried fruits and dried vegetables for a long period of time. I think there's an opportunity to do that in the US as well. If we can have gardeners and small farmers work to have community centers where we take those, and we have dryers that are shared, and we can talk about how they're funded separately. But if you're able to take that produce and dry it, and obviously there's certain exceptions, kale will do well, but lettuce may not, and so on and so forth. But if you're able to dry those things, we can open up a whole new market. And if we can get enough people doing it locally, you can actually become one of the core providers in that local market. And I think there's enough grocery stores and other local chains that would be interested in that enough. And as many of you know, when you dry fruits and vegetables, and especially grains and pulses, I don't know that there's ever been an incidence of listeria or other bacterial infections or viral infections or protozoa, for that matter, from those dried products. There may be that I don't know about. You guys are welcome to tell me. But from what I know in the industry, I've never seen that. At least they're far less than what we see. So something to think about. What we started out looking at were these core 12 metrics. We said, what does a farmer really need to know to be good at what he needs to know? And we're working with Colorado State University to create CE credited classes for small farmers, and they can take it online, they can take it on their phone or what have you, and they can learn everything they need to know about soil and how to rebuild soil and how to do cover crops and how to do work towards no-till farming and so on and so forth to preserve the soil, build the depth of the soil, and even doing pastures where they're growing multiple kinds of grass seeds and rotating animals and what have you to build a stronger, deeper root system, so on and so forth. Seeds, fertilizer, irrigation, all of these. But one of the pieces that's kind of an overlapping part of this is education. There has to be educational formats for all of these things to work efficiently. People are going to learn about how to harvest better, and you're going to want those standards to be the same. Platforms to offer education. Many of these people have SMS phones. They don't have smartphones. How do you educate hundreds of millions of people? A lot of that's done by individual NGOs and others that are going into the field and working on it from that capacity. But there has to be some bigger systems. And I'll talk about one of them that's been very successful later. But the others, there need to be technologies to help fill the gap where some of these gaps exist. And there's a number of technologies that help farmers identify pests, technologies that help them test their soil that are less expensive. We now have technologies out of CU actually that came out, very low cost, effective field testing for aflatoxin. But the most important one really is working with governments to make sure that the governance side is. The one thing that can rapidly kill a whole market is the government. I was at a meeting with global leaders in Africa last year, a thing called the Agra Conference, and they had several presidents from different countries there, and people were clapping and doing whatever. And then the president of Ghana, who's a very bright guy and actually he's really sharply dressed fellow as well, was kind of leaning back in his seat, and they said, "So, President, what do you think is really your responsibility? What do you think is your job as president of Ghana to help propel the agricultural market forward?" And he said, "That's quite simple. My job is to eliminate the hurdles and get the hell out of the way." And he got a standing ovation. People were screaming and clapping and standing, and he was quite right. And other presidents from then on after took a piece of that and added it to their response as well, because people realized how important it is for government to be a facilitator of business and not have deleterious effects. So designing a food system, these are kind of the pieces that we looked at. And when you go to looking at a zero hunger formula, how do you take each one of these and measure them for a single food system? Say it's corn, say it's fruits or citrus or whatever the case may be. How do we look at each one of these? What are the metrics that we use to organize it, to make it flourish, and to sustain it so that it continues? And we're working to put all those together through the Zero Hunger Formula project. What we found is that in this phase one effort, in resolving the issues in food security, and I'm going to take a short step backward. If you can take the 800 million we talked about, there's really about 440 to now 550 million in sub-Saharan Africa who live in dire poverty, who are regularly hungry, that are farmers. And we're expecting them to grow the food for the next billion people on the planet. Interestingly, if you give them the education that they need, and it doesn't have to be perfect. If you could just link together the basics, so there's no huge gaps in that system we just talked about. Not only can you lift the 450 to 600 million people out of poverty, but you'll feed the world as well, right? You do both. You actually solve two problems at the same time. If you teach them how to take care of themselves, not only will they be able to take care of themselves, but they'll have the capacity to feed the rest of the world. And if you do it properly, what we found is that in a period of 12 to 18 months, if they're given the proper education, access to the resources, the inputs that they need, access to financing, not free, but given the access to proper financing for those inputs, and a market to sell into, those four things, you can lift millions of people out of poverty every year. So now what we're trying to do is say in food security in the US, what do we need to do to bring that system together that includes the education and the technology and the financing? It does require a combination of commercial farms, community farms, and family farms. And there's going to have to be a set of standards. And we know from as large as this group is, I mean, EAT is 27,000 plus people, even within this huge community that listens to all this information, you are the 1/10 of 1% in the ag world, right? These are the best and the brightest in this space. There still is disparity between what you think is the best practice in certain things. In agriculture, as you probably know, most of them call it good agricultural practices, not like medicine, best agricultural practices, because there's such variety. And sometimes there's not one single right answer. There's multiple answers that actually work. So how do we set standards that allow for some diversity in those standards, some dynamic measures in that? And so that's part of the challenge. But if we're going to do an ecosystem for producing more and better, we also want to, if you want to say which one is better, one of the things that's key in that is looking to how you do it without waste. And waste, we think of it as food waste and we think of it as agriculture waste, but there's also the other waste, right? Soil that's not used properly is a waste. Soil that is managed poorly and is eroding is a waste. So there's a number of different things that we want to do in addition to access to education and inputs. It's innovating the small farm design, it's innovating the markets and the access to the markets and pushing them into the markets so that we do more and better with less waste, so that we actually have the platform to grow more and better, right? And the third is there does need to be, whether we like it or not, and I've tried not to do things with the government as much as I can, but there requires some collaboration between public, private, and what they call civil society. Establishing macro goals, to work towards a zero hunger formula. You need all three people to put their hands in the pie. You need all three people to say, we want to help on logistics. We want to reduce, we want to get rid of export taxes. We want to do whatever. But if you can get those things formalized, especially when it's focused around those areas in agriculture that are most important. If you live in the desert, you don't need to worry about their policy on beef. You don't need to worry about the policies on pork, right? You just need to worry about the things that have to do with the fruits and vegetables and such that they grow in the desert. But organize what's the most important and bring public, private, civil society together. And then to organize systems for education, finance, logistics, and markets. Without getting into too much detail, I just wanted to kind of end with two different ideas. One is that as we started teaching and training people, we realized that we have a 5,200 acre farm in Uganda, and we can train about 7,000 people every 6 months on that farm. About 36% of those people trained will actually take what they learned about how to prepare the soil, how to select seed, how to set up irrigation, when to pick, how to test it, so on and so forth, how to store it. About 36% will do that in the first year. And one of my first opportunities with USAID or on the BIFED board, the Board for International Food and Agriculture Development, was giving an award to a company based in Kenya for its program that literally took took educational TV and made it fun. They call it edutainment, and literally it was formatted after what we do here with the HGTV. So any of you guys that watch home makeovers, they do farm makeovers. They go to remote farms. Miss Mary, tell us what's going on. Oh, it's horrible. My chickens are not growing and my cows are so skinny and they don't produce so much milk. And then they bring in experts and they come back 6 months later. Oh, it's a miracle from God. I was doing 2 liters per day, now 5 liters per day, and my corn is so big and strong. And it literally, they founded this show on its own, starting new shows and doing independent studies with 13,000 people interviewed and what have you. They found that about 1.6 million people were being moved from the edge of poverty to middle income from a TV show. So we bought the company. It's called Media. It's like media with an E on it. We bought the company and we're syndicating it across Africa and hopefully globally. One of the things we'd love to do is to see that same model be brought to the US. If we're going to focus on local farm systems and gardening and what have you, that educational entertainment model, I think, would work well. Maybe it's just a subset of what's on HGTV. But if any of you have an interest in that, please let me know. The second thing that I was going to challenge you with is, for the zero hunger formula, is the idea that we build an application type model and we get people that are gardeners or farmers that are willing to say, look, I will take the excess that I have. And having had a garden for many, many years, my wife and I always have extra of something. If you could go online and see a calendar from your local food bank and see that they're looking for potatoes, peppers, onions, tomatoes, zucchini, what have you, and you could fill in the gap and say, oh, look, I'll have 2 kilos, 5 kilos, whatever, extra next Wednesday or Thursday, and you take that extra and you deliver it to them. You solve the logistics problem for them, and you keep from wasting that food, and you provide a social service, and you still have the food that you want to feed yourself. If you'd be interested in that, or you think it's of value, I'd be interested in hearing from folks that are gardeners, as well as people that are farmers. And when you're donating product to an organization that's not selling it, you don't have the same requirements that we do if we went to a grocery store. So that's the first step in building kind of community resiliency, I think. But it's just an idea, just one model of many that probably should come to be. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and we've gone for a while.
I see some questions. People are waiting. They were so listening, so they were waiting to the end. Let me just start to go through some of these because we are a little past our time, but people are still hanging out. What about, and I'm going to broaden this one, a lady asked about allergies to soy. But what about just generally allergies? Has that been an issue at all as you've worked with people with banks and places that you're putting food? And I'm sure it must just be offering options. But what are your thoughts on that?
No, you're exactly right. So we have, and that's another reason that having production schedules where you're doing it in volume helps. So For example, where we produce things in Utah as well as in Africa, we're able to do whole groupings of thousands of meals at one time on the same tables. It can be then cleaned and processed, or in a separate facility where we have ovens, for example, that do one thing and then they're auto cleaned, and then we can add other stuff in. And so in the U.S., it's a little bit different, but we do offer meals that are gluten free. We have several that are we have nothing actually with nuts in it, for example. But in sub-Saharan Africa, what's interesting is a lot of those things that people with celiacs and related issues with, is a lot of the ancient grains don't have that problem. So if you're using things like teff and amaranth and what have you, a lot of those, there are a lot of grains and pulses and what have you that are perfect for people that have high risk for allergies.
So this is several questions from the guy that has the very cool name, Mirko Matic. By the way, Mirko's in Croatia. He says, do you have problems with corruption? Let's start with that one. And then he goes beyond that. So let's just start with that one.
Corruption? Well, we don't in Africa, but we do in the U.S. It's a great question. And yes, we have issues with corruption everywhere. And can you hear me? If any of you have seen the commercial with the little boy,
yes,
who's sitting on his bed, and his father walked in to find him with marijuana, and he said, "Son, where did you learn about that stuff?" And he looks up at him and said, "I learned it from you, Dad. I learned it from you." Well, when you go to countries in emerging, developing markets, and you see some of the things that happen where money disappears, or bureaucracies are created to waste money, or to create or to push dollars to people that they like and whatever, it really, you're kind of going, I can't believe this. But if you happen to do like me and you fly back through Washington, D.C. on your way home, you go, oh, that's, it's just as bad in the U.S. as it is in other countries in some ways. But in other places, it's significantly worse. So what we do, the simple answer is yes, we do see it. And we only go to countries where there's buy-in from that country. For the World Food Bank, for example, we do commodity buying and selling on our own. If we do development, if we invest in anything vertical or equipment or manufacturing or whatever processing, it requires the government invest as well. We want them on the hook, typically with first loss risk money. Because if something happens, they're the ones that take the risk, and our stuff is more flexible, dynamic, and sometimes those assets are sitting in a parent entity outside of the country. But it is a big issue. The worst challenge is actually the smaller people, right? The governance issues you can work through, and once you've stabilized them, they're okay. The biggest issues you have, which is why we just literally today have changed some of what we're doing in a couple of countries, I'm not going to say the countries, but in sub-Saharan Africa, is because the borders have been largely closed by COVID. So there's trucks piled up at the border waiting to move across. So people are saying, well, buy your stuff now so you can get it across. I can guarantee you, all of these borders that have been crossed, the guys working at the borders haven't made any money for a few months. So the trucks that get across are going to be the ones that pay the bribes. And so you have to wait for that to move itself down a little bit before you go back in. So there's some things that you can effectuate change, others that you can't. But it is a good question, and that's why each system has to be recognized where those inefficiencies and where all of that exists in each geography. And it's different in every country.
Yeah, makes sense. By the way, last call for people, if you guys have got any other questions. Mirko's got a couple more. I'm going to ask those, but if somebody else throws one in, we'll get it answered. His second question is, are there special interest groups invested in keeping things the way they are?
Wow. Really good question. Yes, and this is probably not the platform to talk about it. But yes, there are, and I can tell you stories on the side, but I wouldn't want to do anything that would be public. But the simple answer is yes. There are actively groups in every arena you can think of. that are funding, keeping things the way they are. I'll give you an example since it's historical. I was a trader for many years, and I would call trades directly in to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the Board of Trade. I had two brothers that owned a big firm there. Back in the early 90s, they were the CME got together, and their software and hardware was 10 years old. As you can imagine, there was a lot of difference between 1984 and 1994. And they said, we should do, this big multi-million-dollar renovation, because the time it took for orders to go, when I would type in my order and it would go to a lady, she would pick it up and type it in. And from the time she typed it in for it to show up on the screen on the floor would be 45 to 60 seconds. But in the meantime, she could call the trader and say, I just sent you an order to buy 100 lots of, March corn. And so he could go and buy that corn knowing there's another order coming in to buy it. So he could buy it before the market started moving up. And then he would sell it to me when he saw my order come 45 seconds later, because he's obligated by law to honor the order as it comes on the screen. And so that delay, that 45-second delay actually gave an opportunity for him to create an arbitrage, for him to step in front of those orders. And so they had a group get together to vote and say, should we do this renovation to keep up with NASDAQ and all these other people to make the markets more efficient? Unanimously, they voted not to do it. They made more money on the market being inefficient than it being efficient. And that happens all the time, all over the world.
Yeah, makes sense. One last question. And if you would, everybody, the way we applause for people on internet sessions is putting ones in. If you would, just throw some ones in there. Kate says, I love the presentation. It gives me lots to think about. Thank you so much. And then last question for Mirko. Do they learn, and they meaning, I think, when you're doing the teaching, and I think he was alluding to possibly even the last piece where you were talking about the company that you just purchased that's going to be doing the media presentations. Do they learn proper systems, hot composting, worm composting, static composting? I think it's more just generally related to compost.
That's really great question. And, it depends. So we teach, during the season, we have 26 episodes per season, 2 times a year. And so during the season, when they're talking about soil preparation and then management, and you're putting composting on, what have you, it depends on where they are. So if you go to a farm and she has chickens and maize, her measure from composting is going to include chicken waste, right? And food waste and da-da-da-da-da. But if you go to someone else who's a hog farmer and something else, his is going to be a little bit different. And so they adapt it so that they're showing numerous ways, hopefully, over the course of a season. It also means that every year there's something new that's coming up. So the answer is yes, but it's different depending on which farmers they're going after. Very much like the home makeover shows, the way that they make it over depends on the style of the home and the age of the home and that sort of thing. So so it allows us to create new content every season. Thank you.
Oh, well, I think Wayne is frozen. Wayne.
Okay.
Oh, okay, let me see if he comes.
So much. Let me just throw this out to our audience. Please remember the things that Richard asked. Oh, I am?
You're on.
Oh, no. Okay. I just wanted to implore our audience, and we have about 10 times as many people who will watch the replay as that watch this live, Richard, to think about the things that Richard asks that he needs help with. And specifically, even the last couple, but there were 3 or 4 others. So we thank you so much. I just know everything you said is going to be really meaningful to our community. Everybody in our community cares about the things the same way you do, and a lot of times they don't know how to deal and help with them. So thank you, and let's get together sometime. And don't make yourself a stranger. Come up here in Northern Colorado and hang out. So
I'll do that. Well, thanks so much. I
And
appreciate it.
Mark, why don't you take us out?
Thanks.